Hi all, welcome back to the Sprucegate Modeling. Today we will be jumping into making a winter diorama for our Panzer IV. Alright, so I'm going to start with just a big block of insulation foam which I'm going to carve into shape. I've kind of traced out what I want, a road and a house, as well as a little hill next to the road, and I'm just going to be pretty aggressively chipping away with an X-Acto knife until I get the shape that I want. It's better to do this in little small bits and then go back and take out more later, because you don't want to really overcut here. Those hunks that you're seeing me take off right now, those are the biggest chunks that I took off on any given thing. I'm also just going to add a little bit of texture to where the road's going to be, some ruts. These are basic outlines, as I'm going to be putting some clay on over where I'll really sculpt the stuff into it. Here you can see what the final layout is going to look like, but hopefully it'll look a little bit better than that. Speaking of clay, here we go. I'm going to be adding a ton of PVA glue into my air dry clay. It helps with the shrinking. It isn't perfect. You're going to have to fill some cracks, but it helps. It's very messy though. I didn't wear gloves. I'm sure you will be smart and wear gloves. That is definitely the one thing that I would suggest here. I'm then just going to put it onto my diorama. I'm going to take it and I'm just going to smooth it over with my fingers. This is easier if your fingers are wet or covered in PVA glue. And I'm going to be using a ton of PVA glue. I put down a layer of PVA glue before I even put this on because I do not like the shrinkages. Here you can see me putting on that layer for somewhere else. I'm just putting a bunch down with a stirring stick, and then I'm just going to paint it around with a paintbrush. I'm then just going to put more of the clay down. I'm going to form it over the contours. I'm trying to keep this relatively thin. I had a problem where one of the pieces was much thicker than the other ones, and I had to really go back and thin it out. And now I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to start texturing the road. With a pencil, I'm going to be adding like kind of main wheel ruts down where the side would be. Again, I'm just going to smooth it over with my finger so it isn't too sharp. Then I'm going to be adding smaller wheel ruts all throughout the road with a popsicle stick, or with a toothpick. Then for the fun part, I'm going to be taking the tracks of my tank and I'm going to be pressing them into the road to create track marks. Here you can see that I put on a layer of PVA glue because it helped with the smoothing everything over. I'm then going to put down still more PVA glue, and I'm going to be sprinkling a bunch of dirt onto the hill and parts of the road. I'm going to be adding some larger rocks to the road, mostly, instead of just dirt. And then finally, with PVA glue, I will be putting down a bit of it after it dries on the dirt, and I will be adding static grass to it. I don't have a fancy applicator, unfortunately, so I'm just using my tweezers. Alright, so now we will be moving on to the house. I have a figure of the same scale, 1/56, that I will be using, and I'm just carving a door out around him. I did the same thing for some windows, and now I am just going to rip out the windows and the door with my tweezers. This is actually surprisingly easy to get really, really clean if you do the cuts well. It'll just kind of pop out, and you won't really need to worry about ruining the surface that you're going to be carving on later. Speaking of which, I will now be carving some rocks onto my stone house. I'm just using an X-Acto knife, and I'm just cutting out kind of amorphous blob-shaped rocks. These are pretty small. I've seen them done bigger, I've seen them done smaller, I've seen them done in a lot of different ways, but I like the way the carved foam looks, and I have the materials available. So, just very careful carving out each individual rock. These will not look great after you just have carved them, but it's really satisfying to get them to all, line up like that when you're carving. And of course, they'll look a lot better once you spread them out and texture them. That's what we'll be doing next. We'll be spreading them out. I've taken a micro applicator and I've just put it in the cracks around the rocks, and I've just moved it along. This drives a much larger gap in between the rocks and makes them look much more realistic, although they still don't have any of that nice rock texture. You are going to need to be, again, pretty careful with this, because as with the door and windows, you can actually rip one of these rocks out if you aren't too careful, and it's actually a really cool look if you are missing one or two, but you got to be pretty gentle here. We're then going to be texturing it. This is literally just a toothpick that I cut the end off of, and I'm going to be putting it in the cracks, and I'm going to be pushing some of the rocks down to create a much more uneven surface. And actually, the texture from this actually looks pretty good for these small scale rocks. Again, going to be doing this on everything. It's time to move on to painting. First, I will be priming this base with the Vallejo light gray primer. This should go on a pretty solid layer. You're probably going to need one or two over everything. Those white things, that's filler for the cracks that I did in fact encounter after all that PVA glue. So you can also see that I've left an area out for the house here that is not covered in clay. I'm going to be taking some of the Vallejo black primer, and I'm going to be going over to create some just artificial tonal differentiations. At the beginning, I'm doing this on just random spots on the hill, and then the darker spots on the road. So that's the tank tracks. You can see I've done it in the drainage ditch. I've done it all over those that rock pathway over like the culvert that I made into there. And then it's just on to painting the base. This is, I believe, chocolate brown that I'm just spraying over everything. This is a pretty thin layer because I want to be able to see those differences from the black and the light gray primers, which I found is actually working surprisingly well for giving me a baseline. I'm then going to go in and I'm going to do some shading. This is a light earth color that I'm just going to be kind of randomly spraying over a few areas. I'm also going to paint the grass with a very yellow color because it's dead grass. I just did 2 layers of increasing lightness here. This is just a very, very, very thin light earth color that I'm just kind of misting over a lot of stuff. This will just, again, add a little bit more contrast, make the base look a little bit more realistic. And then we're on to washes. This is a winter road, so it should look pretty muddy, so I'm going to be taking some oil washes that I've mixed up, and I'm going to be applying them very generously all over the road. This one is a very dark brown, burnt umber mostly, with just a tad of black, and this goes over everything. This is to really get the depth out in those tracks, the depth out from that dirt, even if most of it's going to end up being covered in snow anyway. And then I'm going to move on to my more detail wash. This is mostly black with a bit of burnt umber just to give it a little bit more color. And this gets applied over all the little details that I want to be super recessed, and it adds a really great element of dimension to the mud. I've also applied a couple other rather random oil washes, just one that's slightly lighter and one that's slightly darker, just again add a little bit of tonal variation to everything. If nothing else, at least it'll look interesting. For the house, it's just going to be that black primer first. Again, everything, I got to make sure I get all the gaps here because there's a lot of them with the stones. And yeah, good coverage as always on a primer. That's exactly what you're looking for. Once you have that good coverage, I'm going to take my that light gray primer I was using earlier, and I'm going to just spray it down from above. This will add a really, really great looking highlight on some of the rocks, and I'm going for some of the edges around the door, the windows, and the cornerstones. I'm going to make those much, much lighter than the other areas just because I think it looks really interesting. Here you can see that the baseline black and gray for the rocks is done. Of course, there's going to be some detail painting. First, I'm going to take khaki, and I'm just going to pick out a bunch of random rocks. This is just done using a detail brush. Here you can see there's really strong contrast between this and the base, and I like that because this is going to get really toned down with washes and some wall filler that I'm using later. And of course, khaki isn't the only color I'm using. This is a much darker gray than the one that is on some of the stones that I'm picking out. And this is a much brighter tan. Again, contrast is key here. These are going to have to pop later. If I can't tell that I did this step, then there's no point in doing it. It's also a lot of subtlety. And here's that wall filler. So this is just going to be applied pretty thick with a brush over all of the stones. In case you couldn't tell, it is very white, and it actually works pretty well for mortar. My way of doing it is I paint it on really thick, and then I take a Q-tip, I dip the Q-tip in water, I rub off as much of it as I can, and this gets it really thin, make sure that it just stays in the cracks. And then I take a dry Q-tip and I clean everything up. It is very Q-tip consuming, but it actually gives a pretty nice looking result when you're done. Here you can see my strategy a little bit better. It's a little bit more defined. Here's the water Q-tip coming in. You can start to see the rocks again. And make sure that it really flows into the cracks. And then the dry Q-tip comes in and really cleans it up. I'm doing this over everything except for the cornerstones. The cornerstones I'm just going to leave as is. I like how those look. Alright, here it is when dry. Of course, it's very bright because it's wall filler and it's pure white, so I will just be adding a dark wash over all of it. This is just straight black wash right over the top. Here you can see the differences between some of those stones that I picked out earlier. And I'm also just going to try to bring up the color in those gaps again a little bit more just with a whitewash. Because the black wash brought it down a lot more than I actually thought it would. Yeah, here you can see that those are getting a little bit brighter with that. I'm then going to be taking a brown wash, and I'm going to be going over a bunch of random rocks. Not all of them, but I'm kind of going over them in like clumps. And then I'm going to take a gray wash and do the same thing on a couple of the other rocks. Again, tonal variation, can't hurt. Then for the door, this is literally 2 stirring sticks that I've cut out to fit the door that are glued together, and then I'm painting them brown. This is not very complicated. I didn't really choose to go super in detail with this door, just kind of boarded up look. And then I'm going to be taking some green wash. I'm going to be going over a little bit of moss. I found that it is there even in winter seasons, especially on this wood. So I'm doing this in the corners. It's pretty light, but it should be noticeable, noticeably green. Now it's on to the snow effects. That roof was just made using cut up foam. It's nothing special, and then I just painted it black and gray. This snow effect is baking powder, or baking soda that was thinned really, really heavily with water and a little bit of PVA glue. This will dry almost opaque. This is a slightly thicker thing, but still very, very thin. This is my baseline kind of slush level. But on this, I have actually added a little bit of white paint into the mixture to make sure that it does have a little bit of pop when it dries. This will be applied pretty haphazardly over anywhere that I think there would be snow. Very small amounts on the road. Not very large amounts on the road because it's supposed to be a well-traversed road with traffic. This will also dry pretty glossy, so I'm using a really, really thin version on the road to give it a more muddy look. Here you can see that first layer all down. Alright, now it's on to the big snow. This is not really that thinned, and it is with quite a bit of white paint. Just that prevents yellowing and makes sure that it really does have that pop. This is mostly PVA and baking powder and not as much water as the other one. And this will be to represent the main base of snow. This is going all over the side of the hill with just a couple patches still exposed. Try to get relatively standard thickness and then really thin it out as you get toward the edge of the road. Covering the grass in it does actually give a really interesting look, except that I keep some of the grass exposed just so that it isn't just a bleak monotony of white. I'm then going to be adding some powder. This is just straight baking soda that I am sprinkling all over all of this while it is still wet. It will stick, and it will give it a really nice powdery look. Here you can see that I've taken the tank, it's going a little bit into the snow, and I'm just going to be adding more snow around the track area to make sure that it doesn't really look like it's floating. Here you can see it again. I'm just going to be painting it down where the track is there. And then I will be adding some more powder all over it. That was a little bit too much, but I can take it off later. And then I'm going to press the track back in. All right, we're done. Here you can see some of the completed photographs of my Panzer IV on the winter diorama. I'm actually pretty happy with this one. It turned out pretty well, especially for a relatively small scale diorama. And I really like how the snow looks. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.